Today we're going to talk a little bit about doing research in public health. We're going to focus on epidemiology in general and specifically look into CBPR, which is a type of research that's done with and in communities. So starting off with epidemiology. Epidemiology in general is a study of the incidence, distribution, and control of diseases in a population. It is a way to surveil populations and groups of people. It is a way to monitor diseases, so we can monitor preventable causes of birth defects, for instance. By using vital statistics based on data that we can easily collect, we can calculate an individual's risk of dying before a certain age. So obviously we can use these kinds of statistics to estimate and monitor disease rates, and one of the most common ways to do so is to determine the incidence and prevalence of a disease, which are two of the most basic epidemiological concepts. And the distinction between the two is very important. The incidence of disease is the probability of a disease occurrence within a specified period of time. In other words, the risk of contracting a disease, and refers only to the number of new cases of a disease. Prevalence indicates how widespread a disease is. In other words, it's the commonality of a disease in a population, so it refers to the number of cases overall within a population. To explain this a little bit further, let's do an example with breast cancer. If 5 women are diagnosed with cancer out of a study population of 100 women, the incidence rate is 5%, or 0.05. So that refers only to the new cases during the period of time that was studied. So in that same group of 100 people, we have these 5 newly diagnosed cases, but there are also 25 other women who already have breast cancer. Then we would say that the prevalence is 0.3, or 30 out of 100, or 3 out of 10 women. So the incidence would be 5%, but the prevalence would be 30%. So when we're talking about incidence, the numerator is the number of new cases during the specified period of time that's being studied, while the denominator is the number of all susceptible individuals at that time. There's also an implication for duration. So there's a number of new cases diagnosed over a specified period of time. So there is some period during which we're counting the number of new cases. So this is measured by a cohort study. Whereas for prevalence, you're doing a cross-sectional study at a single time point, and your numerator is all of the number of cases counted at that time, and the denominator is the number of individuals, including the cases and non-cases of a population. So again, incidence refers to the number of new cases divided by the number of susceptible people over a period of time, whereas prevalence is the number of cases divided by the number of people who could have that disease at a single time point. Conducting a study of incidence, you would track a given population, whereas to measure the prevalence, you would just be looking at a single time point, and you could do this via survey. You wouldn't have to actually track anybody's health. Observing the number of cases or events is actually the first part of the epidemiological method. So this is a step-by-step way that epidemiological research is conducted. Usually studies don't do all of these things, but rather one study informs the next, and so on. So we've covered kind of the first 4 steps here: observing, counting cases, relating cases to the population at risk, and then making comparisons with incidence and prevalence. But what incidence and prevalence don't tell us is what conditions necessarily cause a disease. For that, we need to develop a hypothesis and then test it. I think we all know what hypothesis testing is from a basic standpoint, but as public health or community nutrition master's students, it's important to understand on a greater level. So hypothesis testing is a way to determine a cause and effect relationship. There are different types of biases that might affect the outcome of a hypothesis test, like selection bias. Selection bias is choosing a study population that's not random. If the sample is not a random sample, then it's not representative of a population overall. There's also measurement bias. Measurement bias favors a particular result due to the method or type of measurement. In other words, the measurement systematically overestimates or underestimates the true value. An example of this would be weighing people on a scale that's not calibrated. The scale would consistently produce inaccurate weight measurements. There's also confounding bias. Confounding bias is when the relationship between an exposure and an outcome is distorted due to some other variable. For instance, if you're looking at the relationship between activity level and weight gain, then that relationship also depends on age. In other words, age will affect how much weight someone gains due to inactivity. So to properly examine the relationship between activity level and weight gain, you have to control for age in your study. And if there's not a cause and effect relationship by two variables, then the relationship is due to chance. But hopefully, when you test your hypothesis, your study is not biased in some way, it's not incorrect due to random chance, and so you're uncovering some truth about a relationship about cause and effect. So you will generate a hypothesis and then test it in a controlled manner. So nutritional epidemiology is a study of nutritional determinants of disease in human populations. That seems pretty obvious. Epidemiologists work with other health professionals to identify the causes of disease and to propose strategies for controlling or preventing health problems. Nutritional epidemiology can be used to describe a community's health problems and to determine whether health is improving or getting worse. So that's really important because we have the ability to track populations over time. One of the things that nutritional epidemiologists do is examine food consumption at various levels. At a national level, we measure food consumption on a per capita basis. This is where we get statements like, the average American consumes 54 pounds of poultry every year. But there are huge errors in these measurements, like calculations regarding production, waste, and consumption. So these are very, very loose numbers, but theoretically, we're using these numbers to formulate agricultural policies. We also measure consumption on a household level, which is done through community health surveys, like the profiles you looked at in the first week of classes. These measures take into account the age and sex of people in a household, as well as other factors. And there are a number of different measures to collect this data, all of which you already know about, including surveys, a food diary, 24-hour recalls, an FFQ, or by conducting a diet history. And just as a reminder, I've included a table here with the strengths and weaknesses of each method on this slide. So these are all examples of self-reported data, but we also collect information through observations or by using nutritional biomarkers. And we're going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail. So the method of self-reported data that you choose depends on the epidemiological study that you're going to do. For instance, if you were doing a year-long study to examine the relationship of diet and bone density changes in postmenopausal women, you would want women to complete a number of food diaries. If you had a sample of people who got food poisoning today, then you'd want to look back in time, retrospectively, at what people ate yesterday, so you'd be doing a 24-hour recall. Or, if you're doing a retrospective study and looking at the number of people who were recently diagnosed with diabetes, you'd want to look at the foods they've been having for the past year. So you'd want to choose an FFQ. So again, the measure that you choose, or in this case, the measure of self-reported data that you choose, depends on the type of study that you're going to do. There are also observational methods of conducting dietary assessments. And these are methods of direct estimation and recording of everything that somebody eats during a meal or over the course of a day. You do this typically by plate waist studies. A plate waist study is where a picture of somebody's full plate is taken before they eat the meal, and then another picture is taken after they eat the meal. Then an estimate is made of how much and what types of foods they actually ate. There are also nutritional biomarkers that are indicative of consumption. These are external indicators that reflect food intake. So it's important to note that these biomarkers aren't really examined in public health settings, but they're more frequently used in medicine and other epidemiological studies. And the data is used in nutritional epidemiology. Anyway, the metabolites in urine and in blood are indicators of food intake. So usually urine or blood would be collected to corroborate self-reported data. You don't usually use these biomarkers on their own without any kind of self-reported data. So to review, there are strengths of each method of data collection. You can pause this and have time to read through the slide, but I'm just going to move on for right now because there are also weaknesses of each method of data collection. So you can view those here. Again, you can pause the slide if you want to review it. So there are several different study designs that we might do in nutritional epidemiology. Hopefully you've heard of all of these things. Observational studies include case studies and case series, ecological studies, cross-sectional studies, case control, or cohort studies. We can do meta-analyses, which synthesize all of these data, or we can do experimental studies, which are essentially controlled trials. So let's go over each one of these types of studies. Case studies are very specific and conducted on an individual level, making them great to study certain conditions and diseases and terrible for others. So you would want to study a rare genetic disorder with a case study because there simply aren't a lot of people within the population who have that rare genetic disorder. But if you were interested in examining the rates of obesity among a certain group, then you wouldn't want to do a case study for that because there are so many people that are obese. So exceptions to the rule are often used as case studies. Or you can do a case series if you have several people who have a particular condition. In general, case studies are good for generating ideas, tracking toxicity, or to document the beginning of an epidemic. But we also do that with ecological studies. So ecological studies are studies of risk-modifying factors on health or some other outcome based on a population that's defined either geographically or temporally. So both risk-modifying factors and outcomes are averaged for the population in a given geographical or temporal space and then compared using standard statistical methods. So when we're looking at something like a viral epidemic, this is a good type of study to conduct. Nutritionally, we might look at environmental determinants of health related to certain diseases or disorders. And we worry a little bit about ecological fallacy, which occurs when conclusions about individuals are drawn only from analyses of group data. So these are descriptions of cause and effect relationships that are not quite true. So one example of this is that in countries with high saturated fat intake, there's a higher incidence of coronary heart disease compared to countries with low saturated fat intake. And that might be true. However, that doesn't prove that individuals with coronary heart disease had high saturated fat consumption, or that high saturated fat intake causes coronary heart disease. So these are not cause and effect relationships that are uncovered, and it would be false to make that cause and effect conclusion based on this type of data. Cross-sectional studies are essentially a snapshot of what's going on in a population at a single point in time. So again, we can't determine anything about cause and effect. An example of this is the US Census. The census is cross-sectional because it's completed at a single point in time every 10 years. And because it's repeated, we can examine changes over time. But again, we don't learn anything about cause and effect relationships from a single time point. Case control studies take two groups of people, so one with a disease and one without a disease, and retrospectively examine the exposures. So an example might be looking at the diets of people who have colon cancer and those who don't to determine differences in consumption. So your groups of people would be people who have colon cancer, people who don't have colon cancer, and then you'd go back and do an FFQ about what they ate. So you might use this to identify the dietary risk factors of disease or identify the food likely responsible for some foodborne illness, or to do safety evaluations of food products. Retrospective cohort studies study a group of individuals who were exposed to something in order to determine the influence that it had on the development of the disease. It compares a group that had the exposure to those who didn't have the exposure and then looks at the rates of their same disease. So in this example, you could look at the rates of neural tube defects of newborns before a policy was made and then after a policy was made to see if the rates of neural tube defects decreased after the policy was implemented. Retrospective cohort studies examine exposure in the past, while prospective cohort studies examine populations into the future. So you'd have a group of people that you would follow into the future over time to look at risk factors for disease and then who develops those diseases. In general, though, we don't use the terms retrospective and prospective because they're obviously overlapping to a degree. So if you were doing this type of study, when you reported it, you would simply detail your methods. Some examples of these are very popular studies that are still going on today, like the Framingham Heart Study or the Nurses' Health Studies. So to summarize those study designs temporally, we can see that cross-sectional studies examine one point in time of exposure and disease. Case control studies look at who has the disease right now and who had the exposure in the past. Retrospective cohort studies look at who was exposed and then who ended up developing a disease, whereas prospective cohort studies look at exposure now and disease in the future. So you can see how retrospective cohort studies and prospective cohort studies are very similar in their design. They're looking at exposure going forward to who develops that disease. Case control studies are less expensive, quick, and they don't require too many people because you can identify an adequate number of cases right away. But case control studies also rely on people's memory of what they did, and people's memory is not super reliable. So there ends up being bias in the data that you collect because it's all self-reported data. Prospective cohort studies have less bias because you're not relying on people's memories, but they require a lot of people because you don't know who's going to get a disease based on the exposure, thereby making those studies much more expensive to do. Meta-analyses combine and analyze data from a group of studies. So if lots of studies look at the same relationship between, say, sun exposure and vitamin D levels, and they use different complicated statistical methods, we can actually combine that data and use the number of participants to create a larger group of participants to examine that relationship. So meta-analyses help us synthesize findings across research studies, which would otherwise be impossible to get because researchers don't often have millions of dollars to conduct a very, very large study with a lot of people. Instead, we take the data from a whole bunch of small studies and we can analyze it together. And then there are, of course, controlled trials, which are kind of the gold standard in medicine. They are human experiments in which people are assigned to receive one or more treatments, and then followed to determine what the outcome is. So they're often randomized. They can be single-blind or double-blind studies. Single-blind means that the study participant doesn't know what treatment they're getting, but the researcher does know. Whereas double-blind studies means that neither the study participant nor the researcher know if the participant is receiving treatment or not. Double-blind is the ideal way to do it because it reduces any potential bias that could come from the researchers knowing what a given participant is receiving. There are also non-randomized controlled trials. Someone would conduct this kind of a study if there was a reason not to randomize, or if you want to gather information about a certain type of population. So let's take the Goldberger and Pellagra study as an example of this. So Goldberger observed that people who contracted pellagra subsisted on a limited diet of pork fat, cornbread, and molasses, whereas those who didn't contract it had much more varied diets. He hypothesized that pellagra is caused by a limited diet. So he conducted a test by feeding convicts the traditional monotonous southern diet of pork fat, cornbread, and molasses, and that produced pellagra. Therefore, he concluded that pellagra is caused by eating a limited diet. At the same time, he was also looking at whether or not it's infectious. So he observed that the prisoners contracted pellagra but not the guards. He also knew the prisoners' diets were limited but not the guards. So he hypothesized that the disease is not contagious. So he tested that by inoculating healthy volunteers with pellagrins, which did not produce pellagra. Therefore, he concluded that pellagra is not contagious. So he didn't randomize this trial. He took two groups of people, prisoners and guards, who already had a limited diet or didn't have a limited diet, and tested his theory. And this study was groundbreaking because until this point, the common medical belief was that pellagra was caused by germs, not by diet. And the word caused is very important here because it's often confused with correlated. And I want to make that distinction because it's really important that correlation is not causation. Two things can be correlated, but that does not necessarily mean that one caused the other. For example, numerous epidemiological studies showed that women, when they're taking hormone replacement therapy, also had a lower than average incidence of coronary heart disease, leading doctors to propose that hormone replacement therapy was protective against coronary heart disease. But when randomized control trials were done, it actually showed that hormone replacement therapy caused a small but statistically significant increase in the risk of coronary heart disease. So when researchers went back and reanalyzed the data from the epidemiological studies, it showed that women that were taking hormone replacement therapy were actually more likely to be from higher socioeconomic groups with better than average diets and exercise regimens. So the use of hormone replacement therapy and the decreased incidence of coronary heart disease just happened to be coincidental. Let's look at another example that's even more obvious. So what might you imagine that cheese consumption would be associated with? Logical guesses might be that high cheese consumption is correlated with heart disease. If cheeses were processed, then maybe it would be a major contributor to hypertension. Or it could be something as simple as cheese consumption is related to weight gain or obesity. But we find that cheese consumption is highly correlated with death by becoming tangled in bed sheets. Does that mean that eating cheese causes people to become tangled in their bed sheets? No, obviously not. So just because two things are correlated does not mean that one causes the other. It only means that there is some statistical relationship. There may not be a practical relationship. And there are different things that we can use to measure the strength of statistical relationships, including a chronological relationship, the strength of the association, the intensity or duration of exposure, the specificity of the association, the consistency of findings, and plausibility. So chronologically, an exposure has to come before a disease. That seems fairly obvious. There has to be a strong relationship between the exposure and the disease. So intense exposure should lead to a severe disease. Specificity of association refers to the likelihood that if an exposure is removed, then there should also be a reduction of that disease, or vice versa. And there needs to be some consistency in findings. Other studies need to show the same thing. Finally, the results have to be plausible. So in the previous example with cheese, it's not very plausible that cheese consumption causes people to die from becoming tangled in their bed sheets. So that's not a very plausible relationship. There are many national institutes that conduct major epidemiological studies. A few are listed here, and you can see the types of studies that they do. So NIDDK serves as a focus for the collection, analysis, and dissemination of data about nutritional disorders and obesity. Whereas the National Cancer Institute obviously focuses a bit more on cancer, and the University of North Carolina's Nutrition Obesity Research Center actually focuses on obesity and public health. When you're doing your design workbooks or you're looking for data in general, there are a bunch of places that you can go. So I just want to provide these resources for you, not only for the workbooks, but for any future work that you do. So epidemiological studies are conducted on a public health level, but we also need to think about community level research. So today I'm going to choose to focus on a particular type of community-based research called CBPR. CBPR is a collaborative approach to research that equitably involves all partners in the research process and recognizes the unique strengths that each one brings. CBPR begins with a research topic of importance to the community with the aim of combining knowledge and action for social change to improve community health and to eliminate health disparities. So we're going to unpack this statement because it's critically important to understand the intent of CBPR. So it combines research methods and community capacity building strategies. A big focus of CBPR is to build the capacity of communities while doing research. So it recognizes the community as a social entity with a sense of identity. And that means that we're working with communities rather than in communities. In other words, we're involving the community in the research process. So that's the community part. It's community-based, and then it's also participatory. So participatory means that there's a shared ownership of research projects, that there's a community-based analysis of public health issues, and that there's an orientation of community action, because action requires participation. And there are a lot of reasons to conduct research in this way. Not all issues are best addressed by outside experts. There's a history of researchers going into communities, studying the people there, and then leaving the community without providing any long-term solutions to problems. More importantly, intervention research like controlled trials don't often yield very positive results, especially in nutrition. Often in nutrition research, researchers are reporting very modest improvements in the area of study. Like there's a 1/4 cup per day increase in fruit and vegetable consumption. Well, getting people to eat more fruits and vegetables by a 1/4 cup per day doesn't actually do much for health outcomes. So traditional research typically doesn't benefit the community studied as much as CBPR could. It doesn't build trust, it doesn't benefit communities, and to date, traditional research hasn't eliminated health disparities. Whereas CBPR is aimed to make research equitable and involve the population of interest. And there are 8 guiding principles of CBPR. So the project should hold local relevance, they should be conducted with mutual trust and respect. Partners involved should recognize that there is knowledge and expertise in communities that can be used and called upon. And it should enhance knowledge and promote changes beneficial to the community. So CBPR should tackle issues that are important to community members and should have a focus on benefiting the community in some way. CBPR research also builds capacity within communities. It adheres to strict human subject standards. It requires that research findings are made available to and disseminated among the community so that they can use the results, and that the data collected and any papers authored are shared by all those involved with the study, not just with the researchers. And the point of this is because being the subject of research is very different from being a participant in research. With a community-engaged approach, communities are seen as partners and collaborators, and community members are viewed as research participants, not as research subjects. One reason for using the term participant instead of the term subject is because in many communities, especially in minority communities, people don't like the term subject. Research shows that that word makes people think of being powerless or to make them feel like guinea pigs in an experiment. Since researchers are forming partnerships with community organizations and working to build trust in communities, it's important to use terms that are appropriate for the setting. And research terminology is changing. Biomedical research subjects are often now called participants, and many major journals like the New England Journal of Medicine have started to use the word participant instead of subject. So the traditional research approach is one in which the researcher defines a problem and then research is done in a community, not with a community. The people are subjects. Community organizations may or may not be involved. The researchers are the ones who gain skills and knowledge. The researchers control the process, the data, and then they also control the dissemination of data. But as we move more to the right side of this slide, then doing research with the community or doing community-based participatory research varies greatly. So you can think about this as a continuum. On the left, there's the traditional research approach, and then as you move across toward community-based participatory research, the community becomes more and more involved. So by the end, the community is help identifying the problem. There are participants in community organizations that are collaborators and partners with the researchers, and then there's a shared ownership of the work that's being done. Within the community-engaged approach, CBPR is at the end of the spectrum. It's the most extreme way to do research with the community because it embraces the greatest degree of relationship building It develops strong community partnerships and has a collaborative approach throughout the research process. So on the left side of this slide, in the darker areas, it's low community engagement, and then on the right side of the slide, you get high community engagement. So starting CBPR work takes developing partnerships and identifying issues together. And let's go over the exact steps of that. First, you have to identify a problem. So community members may approach researchers with a specific problem that they want help with, or researchers may approach a community and propose working with them in a specific area to address a certain disease or to address a certain public health issue. For instance, researchers interested in diabetes prevention might identify a section of the city with high rates of diabetes. Then they can contact community organizations and agencies to determine if there's a community interest in participating in a research project on diabetes prevention. So once a problem has been identified, the next step is to develop a research plan, develop the research design, and secure the funds to do it. In community-engaged research, community organizations may contribute to the proposal draft. They might suggest research questions or offer ideas about recruitment. They can give advice on some of the logistics or suggest other organizations to collaborate with or organizations that can advise on the project. To build trust at this point, the community organizations should receive drafts of the research proposal for their review. Funding the work of participating community organizations is important in order to build trust and establish an atmosphere of fairness. Organizations need to receive payment for their contributions of staff time, space, and other project-related expenses, and that's a departure from traditional research. Typically, with traditional research, researchers will take a cut of funding for themselves. So if I were going to do a study in a traditional research kind of a way, then I might complete a grant and cite some stipend for myself for doing this work. In community-based participatory research, not only would I cite a stipend for myself, but I would also want to pay a fair amount to any community organization that's also participating with me. It's not just a token incentive fee. So often in studies, participants will get, $20 for their participation, which is pretty insignificant. In CBPR, you would give somebody a fair and equitable payment for their time and expertise. When developing the project budget with community organizations, you don't necessarily have to reveal your individual salaries, but overall personnel costs and other project costs should be discussed openly. If possible, the community organizations should contribute to the budget development. The next step is to begin the study in the community. Community-engaged research involves community members as project staff in the office or in the field or as advisors for the project overall. Research can be strengthened by involving community members. Their presence can help with recruitment and the retention of study participants. It can help secure community support, and that'll ultimately lead to a better outcome of the research. Sometimes it's not possible to involve community members directly with the study. In that case, researchers may develop other ways to promote community involvement. Next, you'd want to develop and implement the intervention or your data collection process. Community organizations can help tailor the intervention, advise when problems arise, they can promote the study, they can help collect community responses. So there's a variety of ways that they can actually help with data collection. But of course, community involvement depends on the type of data being collected. Community members could be hired to administer questionnaires, to log participation, to read measurement devices, or to make observations. But it's usually up to the researchers to analyze the data. Community members can help with the data cleaning process or check that data is correctly recorded, but some data analysis may require more complicated statistical methods or more expertise to do the analysis. And then finally, you want to report and disseminate the results. Traditionally, researchers report study results by publishing papers in academic journals. With a community engaged approach like CBPR, you want to disseminate the results to the community, and that may look like different things. Community organizations and leaders are often more interested in how many people participated and who benefited than in the academic study results. Community groups are more likely to want some kind of newspaper article or public meeting or event to present the information that they think will interest community members. So depending on the sensitivity of the topic, a community advisory board may want the data presented in a public way that will help community members understand the results and take action in the future. When you're doing CBPR, community members and community partners should always be given credit for their contributions and attend and present at conferences when appropriate. Any press or local meetings about the research should include the community partner organizations. And if possible, you should include the key community members who are active in the research process as co-authors on academic papers. This is really important and legitimizes the value of their contributions. And receiving credit for contributions is just one way to develop a successful partnership. When developing relationships and you're identifying partners, you want to pay attention to issues of power and privilege, and you want to reframe that within your relationship. You want to establish respect and mutual trust. One way to do so is by understanding the historical basis of mistrust in communities, like the way that traditional research is done, using community members as kind of guinea pigs. You want to identify strategies for building trust and respect, or remove obstacles to establishing and sustaining trust. You want to negotiate goals and objectives, because it shouldn't just be the goals and objectives of the researchers. Community members also have goals and objectives that should be met with shared research projects. So you want to articulate individual partner project goals, but then you want to develop an integrated project goal and objectives that meets the needs of everybody. You will, of course, want effective communication. So that includes developing a shared vocabulary, learning to hear and respond to different viewpoints, and speaking as a collective organization or unit. And then you want shared decision-making strategies. So you want to assess the approach that you're going to use to collaborative decision-making, and you want to adopt one of those strategies or approaches when working with your community partners. And the different stages of research require different skill sets, some of which are best done by researchers and some of which are best done by the community. But the best issues are based on input from both groups. For instance, participants and researchers may agree that obesity is an important concern in a given community. Researchers may want to focus on fruit and vegetable consumption, but the community may be more focused on safe places to exercise in public parks. An intervention will ultimately be more effective if it targets the perceived needs of the community, like the parks issue, because the community is already motivated in that way. So while the researchers might want to focus on fruit and vegetable consumption, they might also choose to focus on making parks safe to access. In order to engage the community in that way, program developers and researchers need to facilitate focus groups, interviews, and conduct community observations, the goal of which is obviously to get strong community buy-in and involvement. An example of weak involvement would be providing the community with information through outreach, whereas strong community involvement would be when community members invest their time and resources into a project. Obviously, then, that increases the likelihood of success and sustainability of a project. So strong community involvement leads to a greater likelihood for sustainability of an intervention or a program, but there are other benefits of involving the community in research as well. For instance, researchers can develop research questions concerning health issues of concern to the community. Since the research questions are studied within the community, results are likely to be translatable to similar communities. Working in partnership with community organizations can help recruiting participants and in obtaining informed consent. When people understand the purpose of research and the results might affect them, they're more likely to support the research and the researchers. The reliability and validity of measurement tools can be improved when community members assist in designing them. So community members can help researchers compose questions and design procedures that will be culturally sensitive and also provide accurate and valid measures. And then lastly, community involvement in the analysis and interpretation of findings can provide important and culturally sensitive explanation for the results. Community members may view the results differently than the researchers, and local interpretation may provide ideas that researchers hadn't considered. So these are just some of the advantages of working with community organizations. A community-engaged approach overall can enable researchers to gain support from community organizations, can improve study instruments, and devise culturally sensitive interventions that interpret research results accurately and with more precision, ultimately increasing the capacity of communities to address issues and problems that arise themselves.